afternoon. My name is Andres Mantilla. I'm the director of the Department of Neighborhoods at the City of Seattle. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. This town hall is a collaboration with the mayor, as well as various city departments within the City of Seattle, in an effort to bring you the most current information available. We're going to present this town hall in two different parts. The first part will be a presentation from Mayor Jenny Durkan, followed by Q&A. If you have questions for the mayor, please put it in the chat box, and we will do our best to track those questions and ask the mayor. If those questions are more related to a department, we can hold on those questions and then we'll ask them after the webinar. The second part of this presentation will be from the departments. We have several of my colleagues here today, and we'll go through those slides after the mayor's Q&A. As a reminder for any media attending, if you would like to ask a question, please reach out to the mayor's office communication staff. For residents asking questions, again, please use the chat box feature, and we will get to those questions. We will do our best to accommodate as many questions as we can. I would like to take this time to just remind you all about the mayor's COVID-19 resource page. This is a great resource for finding all the latest updates from the city. So please visit the COVID-19 resource page at seattle.gov/mayor/COVID-19, and I will put it in the chat box shortly. I'd also like to remind you that DON hosts a webinar that we do weekly on Fridays from 2:30 to 4 p.m. And we structure these webinars based on the community feedback of the issues that they want to hear about. So tomorrow we're going to be having information and presentations about mental health, public safety, our social cohesion campaign called Seattle Together, and then continued updates based on rent and mortgage assistance and small business support. So that's it from me. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Mayor Jenny Durkan to begin her comments. Mayor.
Thank you, Andres. And I want to thank everybody who's been able to join here today, to the members of my cabinet, but most importantly, to members of the community. This is a really hard time for everybody in the city of Seattle. To be at the epicenter of a global pandemic and watch it unfold right before our eyes. We've seen what devastating consequences this has had throughout Seattle. But Southeast Seattle has been particularly hard hit. If you look at the numbers, whether they're the economic health numbers or the physical health numbers, it is clear that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and the economic consequences. We now see what the reports for unemployment are and who in the city has become unemployed. And while it has been devastating throughout our city, the numbers in Southeast Seattle truly are some of the highest. And we know that has great implications, not just for those individuals, but for their family members and for everybody in the community. We're working really hard to try to develop a series of programs where we can help community come together and stay together. It is one of the hardest things not to be able to come together during this time and to do the things that community usually does when it faces hardship. I believe that it will take us some time to get through this, and how we come out of it relies greatly on the choices we make during this period of time. We're working really hard at the outset to make sure we could build as much resilience as possible into those communities who already left at the margins. That's why we put through our program so that no one could be evicted, whether a residential, small business, or community-based organization. We also are working to get grocery vouchers into the hands of families that need them, and the uptake of that program has been significant. We worked hard to get some grants into the hands of small businesses to give them some resilience through this time, and are working on rental assistance and those other programs we need that we know people need to stay in place. We're also working with the county, the state, and our federal partners to try to get as many resources as possible into the community as quickly as possible. We know that we're going to be in this for a very long time. Until there's a vaccine, we will be vulnerable as a community. And as we start to reopen our community and come together again in our businesses and in the places where we enjoy each other's company, we'll see an uptick in the virus. We have to do it carefully. It's going to be reliant on a whole range of testing and contact tracing. But the number one defense against the virus spreading are the choices we all make. And that choice to stay home has worked, but it has caused enormous injury to folks. We know that people feel more isolated than ever before. We know that some of the programs we had in place rely so much on being able to do face-to-face outreach and connections with people. And we as a city want to come together in ways to help you, community-based organizations and communities in Southeast Seattle, to stay connected and to keep that capacity, particularly in areas like youth engagement. We have so many great programs that we've funded from the city together with others like the Rainier Beach Action Coalition or Choose 180. There's a range of programs that we know work, and they work because of those connections. So we're here to help maintain those connections. And you have my commitment that we will do all we can to make sure that as we come out of this, we truly do address those systemic inequities that this pandemic has laid bare, whether it is the social health outcomes or the economic outcomes. It is clear that the chasm we faced before has become greater, and we need to move forward in a very conscious way to center race and social justice and really acknowledge the decades and generations of systemic racism that have contributed to what has happened in this pandemic. Happy to take some questions from people. I want to thank you for joining and thank you for everything you've done to stay home and to really drive that disease level down, to flatten the curve, as they say. We're in this for a while. We know it's hard, and the city is here to serve you. So with that, Andres, I'd be happy to take some questions if there are any.
Thanks, Mayor. And just as a reminder for those on the call, please type in your question on the chat feature, and we will do our best to get to it. Mayor, there's a question around testing, specifically the drive up and walk up testing capabilities in Southeast Seattle. What plans does the city of Seattle have to ramp up testing?
That's a really great question, and we're working with our King County Public Health, the State Department of Health, and also the private hospitals to make sure that we can ramp up that testing. As many of you know, we were able to, about 3 weeks ago, do the walk-up, drive-up testing at the Atlantic City boat ramp. It was enormously popular, for lack of a better description, because of the need for that in the community. We also want to make sure that we get testing capacity at our public health clinics and that we continue to have the ability for community to get tested. We know that just as there's been a disparity in the outcomes, early on there was such a lack of testing that most of the testing was happening in the hospitals when by then it's almost too late because people are sick and presenting at the hospitals. We want to have enough testing that we can actually use that as a tool to keep people healthy, determine who might have the virus, and if they test positive, get them safely into isolation and quarantine, support them in that, make sure we know who they've come in contact with, get them into isolation and quarantine if they test positive, and support them so that we can really continue to slow the transmission of the virus. We don't have enough testing capacity today. It is enormously frustrating to me, as I know it is to the county executive and to the governor. While testing has increased, it has not increased enough, and we are doing everything we can. The city of Seattle has joined with other cities on the West Coast to see if we can start getting our own testing capability. We're also buying testing from perhaps South Korea and others. Because it's become clear that we can't rely on the testing system that has been set up by the federal government to do what we need to do to keep communities safe and healthy.
The next question is around the Stay Healthy, Healthy Streets program. What is the purpose around that program, and what is the purpose of making them permanent in the city, especially in the South End?
So that is a really great question. We know that there has been, through this pandemic, when you ask people to stay home, you can't stay home 24/7. We want people to get out safely, but in parts of the city that don't have as many parks or access places, it's harder to get out and to be able to socially distance. We wanted to make sure that we opened streets so that people would feel safe walking, biking, and try to create a series of connected routes in Southeast Seattle. It's been very popular. Many of these streets were never designed to be arterials or ways that people just traveled on. They were mainly supposed to be neighborhood local access streets. And so we want to make these permanent so that we can continue to have those quieter streets in all parts of Seattle, but particularly South Seattle, where the access to parks and other amenities is lower than other parts of the cities. Um, Slow things down, get neighbors out talking to each other. I do want to mention one thing. It's been raised in a number of other forums, and one I was on today, that in some places, particularly like the Central District and other areas, people who of color have not felt safe on some of these roads because they felt they were singled out or stigmatized. We want to make sure we get the messaging out that that is not going to be tolerated. The whole purpose of opening these roads is to bring us together. And if anyone feels that there has been any act of bias, please do let us know, because we want to make sure that everybody feels safe walking in any street in Seattle.
Mayor, the next question is around how we are helping our unsheltered and homeless populations in accessing shelter space and in broader assistance.
At the very beginning of this pandemic, one of the first things we looked at was how do we make sure we keep our most vulnerable members of the community safe and support them. That include people in senior centers who we knew was the epicenter of the first outbreaks. It included small businesses and workers as economically vulnerable. But people experiencing homelessness presented incredible vulnerability for this virus. So working collaboratively with the state and the county, we set about to try to do a number of things. The county set up a number of isolation and quarantine facilities so that if somebody experiencing homelessness actually got COVID or needed to isolate, they could have somewhere to do it safely. We also set up a number of new shelter beds so that we could de-intensify the shelters that already existed, because we knew we needed to have social distance in them. We try to get and create PPE, the personal protection equipment for the first line providers, do more testing. We also spent a lot of resources pausing the work of the navigation team in the main so that we could do outreach and get more hygiene kits and education to people experiencing homelessness, in addition to creating more hygiene facilities throughout the city. We talked to the library. We saw that when businesses and park facilities started to close, the places that people might otherwise have access to use the facilities were no longer open to them. So we talked to the library and we're able to recall some of the staff to open some library places for people to be able to use those facilities on an ongoing basis. We will continue to work with the community, with our first frontline providers, and with the county and the state. We've also put in a request to the governor and to FEMA to be able to have at a broad scale the ability to bring people inside safely, which we don't currently have. This year, the city of Seattle had already budgeted around $100 million to help people experiencing homelessness. I think we have spent tens of millions of unanticipated costs to try to provide those services, to get people inside, to provide hygiene, to get safer shelter. We will continue on that front, but we're going to need help of a significant level from the governor and others if we want to be able to do this at scale to truly bring more people inside.
The next question is around our education system. What is the city doing to work with Seattle Public Schools and others to address maybe some of those students that have already fallen behind given the new virtual needs for accessing education?
This is really a critical aspect, particularly the summer and in the fall. If there's summer school or in the fall, if schools can't open as normal, we knew already that we had a real opportunity gap in our school system and that students of color were falling behind and not given the access that they needed. I was really proud that Seattle voters voted for our education levy that would give access to free preschool for families so the kids could show up at school ready to learn, that we had money to close that opportunity gap in the K through 5. And then in high school, we really focused students on getting a true career and then giving them 2 years free college. We now know coronavirus has turned a lot of that upside down. And that again, some of the inequities that we knew existed before are even more emphasized now. I've talked to Superintendent Denise Juneau and others to see how the city could help bridge those gaps. If you move classes online, you've got to make sure that every kid has access to a computer and fast internet. About 98% of Seattle public school students have access to the internet, but that number really oversells in some ways what the true access is for many, many families. We worked quickly as we started to close libraries to get as many of the hot spots out as we could, to think about how community centers could still be places, even if they were closed, to provide internet access. We're going to continue to have those conversations because we know that whether schools in a physical building or not, the computer access and internet access is critical to equity. You can't have an equitable economy if everybody can't get on the freeway that matters the most. And so we will continue to work with, not just with the Seattle Public Schools, but with community to see how we can support students and families so that they can have that access together.
Mayor, a question around what the city is, or how the city is working specifically for gig workers and undocumented workers that haven't been able to access state or federal resources.
So we early on knew that there would be that gap. With gig workers, we had some success with other people across the country in lobbying Congress to include gig workers in unemployment for the first time. So workers that traditionally would not have been eligible for unemployment are eligible even if they weren't technically an employee. So if you are a gig worker and you have questions about whether you're covered, make sure you go to the website that Andres has said, or you can go to the Employment Security Department at Washington State. We've got that on our website too if you go to www.seattle.gov. Because many of gig workers do qualify for unemployment, even if they weren't technically an employee. For those who are not documented, it is a very difficult, even more difficult struggle right now because all the federal dollars, or most of them, are tied to status. We were very conscientious to make sure that none of the Seattle programs that we put in place that anybody would be excluded because of their documented status, whether they were or not a citizen. We also are working with the nonprofits to make sure that our rental assistance and all the other programs we have in place also make sure that they're available to everyone. But that won't be enough to close the gap. The City Council this week and I joined in a resolution to the governor to create a large $100 million fund that would truly go to the undocumented residents who are here, living, contributing to our society, have been hit by the COVID virus just like the rest of us, but aren't eligible for those benefits. We know we need that kind of resilience here in Seattle and across the region, and I am going to do everything I can to advocate for those programs.
Mayor, there are a couple of questions around increased gun and youth violence in Southeast Seattle. What is the city doing about this issue, which is still present amidst the pandemic?
It is, and we can remember right before the pandemic, we had a significant increase in gun violence with our youth. And working with the community-based organizations, we knew that was really going to be the long-term answer to that. COVID happened, but it doesn't change what the solution is. And so we need to be working with those community-based organizations in new and different ways to actually get to the youth. We know that the systemic underlying issues still exist, and in many ways are exacerbated by the stay-at-home order because people aren't coming to schools or gathering in places where they might have those counselors and people important in their life that they can talk to about their trauma or their choices. So we are working very hard right now to figure out how do we reconnect as a city with those organizations, but more importantly, build the ability for them to connect through these times. I think we're going to be in a stay-at-home order in some fashion, even as we start to open up. We will not be able to have the large meetings or connections that we had before this. And so all of us together have to be more innovative. And I'll be honest, the city's going to need the community-based organizations to lead the way, and we need to make sure that we empower you in the way that to let you do the work. I found as being mayor over the last 2.5 years that the solutions, the best solutions, the most durable solutions come from community itself. And our best role is when we empower community. And so that's what we want to be able to do going forward. And you're going to hear from a number of the people here today, department by department, how we want to work with you, empower you, and continue that really, really important work going forward.
Some questions around the impact that COVID-19 is having, not only on the 2020 budget, but future budget discussions as it relates to Southeast Seattle. a question about what does this mean for Southeast Seattle in the future in terms of budget?
So the budget implications for the city of Seattle are very significant. We expect that we pass our budgets for 2-year cycles. So we already established our budget for 2020, but the law requires us to keep a balanced budget. So if our revenues don't come in, we have to go back in and give a new budget on how we're spending the money we do. We're probably going to be about $300 million short for 2020, which is a significant amount of money. We're in the process right now of figuring out how we tackle that problem and going into 2021, where there'll be just as significant of a gap. We will be guided by principles. First, at the very beginning of this pandemic, it was clear to me, based on the science that I'd read, that there was a good chance that we were going to have to shut down a lot of our economy. And as we did that, we would lose the revenues that the government depends on, our sales tax, our B&O tax. Those things are very sensitive to economic downturns. And we were right. But we did a hiring freeze. We cut a bunch of costs at the unnecessary costs. We really try to marshal our resources. We'll have that money, rainy day money, and emergency fund money. We also were able to lobby the federal government to get some direct relief to the city of Seattle to provide both to community and to help us provide those services. Those things together still won't be enough. So the principles I will be guided by and the departments will be guided by is our first goal is to make sure that we try to keep in place those services that the community needs most during this time and next year. And not to cut in those programs, and in fact, in some places, if we can, enhance those programs. Second, we want to make sure that public health and public safety don't get cut so that we can't serve communities wherever they are in Seattle. And then third is we want to keep the basic city services that everyone relies on in this city. After that, we're going to be going program by program, really trying to make sure that we're keeping in place and maybe even investing more in the things that matter to us coming out of this crisis. Well, I think this is going to take a long time. We could be, a vaccine may not be here until this time next year or even longer. I do believe that Seattle will come out of this, and we can come out of it strong if we invest in the people who need it and invest in the future. And those are the principles that are going to guide us going forward.
Mayor, I think we have time for 2 more questions. This next one's around climate change. How does the city intend to build on the lessons learned during the pandemic about carbon emission reductions in the fight against climate change?
So that's a great question. And I would say if there was anything positive coming out of this global pandemic, it is that locally and globally, we have seen incredible shifts in the environment for the better. And we have to learn those lessons and figure out how do we make sure that those changes can be as durable as possible. So as we imagine Seattle going forward, I want us to imagine that city and build that city that truly is better for climate change. And that goes back to our healthy streets. Another reason we want to keep them permanent is because we really do want to reduce our reliance on automobiles. We want people to be able to walk and bike safely. We want to make sure that the city of the future is that city where people can leave their neighborhood and get to somewhere by walking or biking that is part of their community. We want a city that is more equitable and more just, where we're really thinking about how does it feel to live in that city? Not just work in that city, but actually live in that city. And how do we make sure that the people living in this city all are together working to make sure that at our heart we know diversity is critical to who we are, and that in every part of the city, regardless of where it is, we reflect that commitment to diversity, and we make sure that parts of the city aren't left behind like they have been. We know that Southeast and Southwest Seattle have been left behind in so many ways. If you just look at the social determinants of health, we're seeing what happens in a pandemic like this. We don't want a Seattle where a kid who is born and grows up in either Rainier Beach or South Park has a life expectancy that is lower than a kid who grows up in Laurelhurst. That's wrong. That's not the Seattle we want. So going forward, it's not just climate change. It is, what is our vision of the city we want to be? And let's make the choices today that will get us closer to that.
Mayor, the last question is around youth involvement and youth development in the recovery and reopening. And how can we make sure that youth, particularly youth in Southeast Seattle, are involved in the recovery for the city of Seattle?
That is such a great question, and it's absolutely fundamental. And we don't have all the answers yet. What we know is not only do you have to be involved, but if you're not involved, we won't be the city I just described. The city going forward is your city. The youth today are going to be the mayors and the directors and the nonprofit leaders in the future. And so as we build this city, having youth involved at the table, listening to them, and mentoring them is going to be a critical part of this. So we are going to be looking department by department and program by program to figure out how do we capture the voice of youth, the energy of youth, and really the wisdom and vision of youth.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Mayor. If you want to have any additional comments before we move forward.
I just want to say again how thank you to all the members of my department and city who are here. I think the people of Seattle should be really proud of how their city has responded so far. I have seen people working 14 and 15-hour days, weeks on end at the beginning of this crisis to figure out how could we really address the needs we knew would be coming to Seattle and coming so rapidly. Building programs for our seniors, for example, who used to be able to come to our community centers for both society and friendship, but also for food, and realizing that meal program was so vital to those people. So transforming that into a Meals on Wheels type of program so we could serve them in their homes, to making sure we got our food banks up and running and supplied and made sure that we could be thinking about healthy foods throughout our Seattle. How do we make sure that people have what they need at least, and then on top of that, what they need to thrive? And so I couldn't say enough about that, but it reflects the city we're in, because the city and the way people have acted have shown the way for the nation. People have done what we asked. They've done the hard things. Many of them have lost loved ones and couldn't mourn together. Many of them have loved ones sick and couldn't visit them in the hospital. All of us know people who've lost their jobs or their businesses. And so working together, I think we not only can get through this, we can come out of it better and stronger. I don't pretend it's not going to be really hard. It will be, but I think we can. But it's going to take all of us. And in Southeast Seattle, we know by every data point how hard this pandemic has been on Southeast Seattle. It's been hard on everyone, but your part of the city has suffered disproportionately. We need to learn those lessons. We need to be honest about them, and we need to address them.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much, Mayor Durkan.
Stay home, wash your hands, and everybody have I hope, Memorial Day weekend, not that weekends are that much different than weekdays for many people, but please do take care.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the second part of our town hall, which is the webinar of the different departments. Sunny, if you can go to the next slide. We're first going to hear from Mariko from the Office of Civil Rights, and then from Adrian Diaz around public safety. Then Bobby and Janae are going to talk about small business and worker resources. We'll then hear from Emily to talk about eviction moratorium and rent relief. Jason Johnson will talk about the city strategies around addressing homelessness. Jessica Fincoven will discuss food access. We'll have Mami Hara to talk about the utility discounts and utility programs for the city of Seattle. And then Randy Engstrom will talk about artist relief and our social cohesion program called Seattle Together. I do want to note that we have additional colleagues here, Sam Asefa from the Office of Planning and Community Development, as well as Sam Zimbabwe from the Department of Transportation. So if you do have questions for them as we go through this, please continue to put them in the chat box and we will try to address them. We are grouping some of the questions into themes so that we can address more questions. So please be patient as we do that. Sunny, next slide. Okay, we'll turn it over to Mariko.
Hi, thanks, Andres. And I can't say how happy I am to be, even though it's virtually, in Southeast Seattle, and how much I wish that we were all together in person. I want to highlight what the mayor said, which is really calling out the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and how it has exposed the systemic racial disparities in Seattle. And I'm going to talk about the anti-discrimination campaign, and what has set that in motion is with the pandemic, we've seen a clear uptick in hate violence, specifically directed at our Asian community. And this is a result of fear and ignorance. And we really need to clearly communicate, all of us, that COVID-19 is not the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, that no specific group of people is responsible for its spread. And as Seattleites, we need to come together and support one another and not allow racism to go unchecked. History tells us that racism has shown up in response to crises before. My own family members were incarcerated during World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when the government put residents of Japanese descent in incarceration camps. This, again, came out of fear and ignorance. We saw widespread Islamophobic vitriol and violence after 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center. And in 2014, another example is with the Ebola outbreak. It led to an intensification of anti-Black racism, especially toward people of West African descent. So to respond to the most current expression of racist acts of hate, the mayor asked Kuvu, who's the director of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, and myself to coordinate the response and to ground our approach in the experiences of those most impacted by this recent surge. We reached out to Asian Pacific Islander community leaders and members to learn from them what the city could do to address their concerns. And we heard how important it was to collect and monitor reports of incidents of hate violence and bias, and that people wanted that work to be done to both acknowledge and affirm the experience of the Asian community and to help us as a city develop policy and direct services so that they're responsive. And so we expanded the capacity. We could change to the next slide, please. We expanded the capacity of our hotline, which you can see on the slide is you can call at 206-233-7100 to now have an additional online reporting mechanism, which you can find at www.seattle.gov/report-bias. And we knew that we needed to have additional ways for people to report acts of bias and discrimination, while we also encourage any crime of bias to be reported to 911. We all play a role in creating communities that are free of hate, bias, and racism. And it's important for us to understand what bias is and what to do if we experience or witness it. And so this is not, the reporting mechanism is not just if you're the victim of such an act, but also bystanders, because we all really need to stand up and denounce acts of racism wherever they are. And it's, of course, not just the Asian community that we're talking about. We've seen an increase in bias incidents against our African-American community members and others. And many of these incidents might not rise to the level of a crime. And so we want to have a place for folks to report them. And we know that many of our residents, for different reasons, don't feel comfortable calling 911. So we want to have an array of ways for people to report these incidents. And another key request of the Asian community members that we talked to was to clearly message that we've got their back, and that messages of support that repudiate bias, hate, violence, and racism from our elected officials and allies from all sectors are important and shared. And so many of you may have seen by now, we've had a PSA by the mayor denouncing hate violence that is translated into multiple languages. And you may have also seen a similar PSA from our chief, Carmen Best. And so we really want to share that message and to make sure that people know that, from the top and throughout our community, this is unacceptable. And so my plea to all of you is to spread the word and to help us make sure that racism remains unacceptable and not the norm. It's when we're quiet and let things pass that that people begin to feel that they can get away with it, and we really need to come together. And so sharing that message with you and hoping for us to all be in partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariko. I'm going to turn it over now to Assistant Chief Adrian Diaz, who's Assistant Chief of Collaborative Policing. Adrian.
Yeah, thank you, Mariko, really trying to ensure that there is no place for hate in this city. Good evening, everyone. I am Adrian Diaz. I'm the Assistant Chief of the Collaborative Policing Bureau, and thank you for having me on this call. Slide change. I want to first acknowledge a young man in this community. His name is Connor Dasa Holland. He was 18 years old. He was a freshman at the University of Washington and a coach for our Rainier Beach track program. He was shot and killed on Mother's Day, and it's a life lost too early. Unfortunately, over my career, we've seen this type of senseless violence that I believe all of you are well aware of. And we take these cases very seriously. If you might have any information, I've included our SPD tip line, 206-233-5000. Even any information that you might have, we can work through whatever that information is, regardless of whether you think it's a rumor or not. Let us work through that. We've been shifting through all the evidence in this case, trying to identify witnesses in any video from the surrounding area. And all of this is useful. All of this information is useful that can help us bring closure to the family. If you hear of information, please reach out. Next slide. The South Precinct has had 53 shots fired this year, 2 resulting in death and 6 resulting in injuries. And as you can see from the slide, we're higher from than the 2 previous years. We've had a cluster in the Brighton Dunlap area, and some of these shootings are a result from fighting between certain gangs. But these are not just affecting Seattle. It has impacted our other cities, and it has affected our Black and East African communities in the surrounding area. From some of our investigations, we've identified people that have been associated with some of this violence, and we've made arrests on some of these people, hoping that this will quell some of the violence. It is important to note that when we've made arrests in some of these cases, not all these cases that we're seeing, some of these are committing violence some of these people that are committing violence are living in Kent and Auburn and other cities. So this is clearly a regional issue. SPD has been working with the interdisciplinary team that is being led by the King County Public Health. We need to look at how we address violence through a public health approach. And right now we are committed to looking at the risk factors and protective factors at how we address our overall prevention and intervention efforts. Slide change. Cities United, which is a program that has been ongoing since Obama's administration, has been looked at by the city at one of the programs that we could implement that focuses on Black male achievement. These are good programs. That is more for the planning phases, but in the short term, we're trying to also organize a smaller group that is formed to look at connecting young people before the summer activity ramps up. This has been a hard time for everyone. We must come up with community-driven solutions and have accountability for those that are creating the violence in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Chief Diaz. I'm going to turn it over to Bobby and Janae now around small business and worker resources.
Good evening. My name is Bobby Lee. I'm the Director of Office of Economic Development. On January 21st, 2020, Seattle became the first city in the U.S. to face the pandemic. By the time Congress passed the CARES Act on March 27th, consumer spending here in Seattle dropped by 30%. As a result, many small businesses were forced to lay off their employees, and unemployment insurance claims shot up 3,500% during the month of March. Today, at the national level, unemployment rate has reached 15%. So for the first few months, the city of Seattle had to quickly push out as many safety nets while hoping that the federal government will quickly ramp up their SBA and unemployment insurance programs. And the pandemic is having disproportionate impact to small businesses owned by people of color, immigrant and refugees, and women. While the coronavirus does not discriminate based on race, without immediate action, its economic fallout will disproportionately affect underserved communities. In general, there are 6 action plans that we have put in place immediately. Number 1 is deferment of taxes and utility payments. Number 2 is small business grants. 3 is assistance with SBA loans and grants and other federal relief programs using 8 different languages. Moratorium to stop commercial evictions and restrictions on commercial rent increases. And number 5, promoting restaurant delivery. And finally, centralizing online resource guide and weekly Wednesday webinars. If you are a small business owner and you want to access technical assistance, please call our office at 206-684-8090. We know that these actions are still not enough, but we are committed to finding new and different ways to help stabilize our small businesses so that we have an economy to come back to when we get to the other side of this unprecedented crisis. I'll now turn it over to Director Jan.
Good evening, Southeast Seattle. Thank you, Bobby. I'm very happy to share this virtual space with you all tonight. My name is Janae Jan, and I'm the Interim Director of the Seattle Office of Labor Standards. So the Office of Labor Standards is the city department that is responsible for overseeing a number of our city's worker protection laws, including laws like the minimum wage, wage theft, our domestic workers ordinance, and our paid sick and safe time ordinance. Our office provides a number of services, including education on our labor standards. We answer worker and employer questions. We investigate and resolve potential violations of the law. We also have strong partnerships with community and business organizations to provide information about our laws and help folks access their rights and understand their responsibilities. So tonight, next slide, please. Tonight, I want to focus on one of our laws very briefly. In 2011, our city passed the Paid Sick and Safe Time Ordinance, a law designed to protect public health in moments like these. The law requires employers to provide employees with paid time off from work to care for themselves or a family member for an illness or a health condition, to go to doctor's appointments, if an individual is recommended by public health official to self-quarantine, for critical safety issues related to domestic violence or sexual assault. Employees can also use paid sick and safe time for an absence that's caused by a family member's school or place of care if it's closed, the closure of a workplace by a public official for health reasons, and if your workplace is a business with 250 or more full-time equivalent employees worldwide, you can also take PSST if your workplace is closed or your hours are reduced because of a health or safety related reason. So this law ensures that employees and family members, can stay home away from coworkers, school, and customers when they are sick, which helps limit the spread of disease and helps supports our community's economic security. In March of this year, I'll also note that City Council amended this law to expand the situations where employees can use paid sick and safe time hours to meet the emerging needs caused by COVID-19. So we understand that many employees and employers will have questions about this law as we navigate the impact of COVID-19 on our workplaces. And it's important to us that you have access to information that you need about these laws. So I encourage folks to visit our website where you can find helpful information. It's available in many different languages. And you can also email or call our team with your questions. So you'll see the contact information on the slide, but because the text might be a little small, our phone number is 206-256-5297, and our email is laborstandards@seattle.gov. Next slide, please. As the mayor and Bobby mentioned, we've seen dramatic job loss in our city. And although the city does not administer unemployment insurance, we know that many workers and our self-employed community members may have been impacted or are impacted deeply. And so, again, as the mayor stated in her opening remarks, unemployment benefits in Washington State expanded under the Federal CARES Act, to cover independent contractors and self-employed individuals. So those include gig workers, delivery drivers, rideshare drivers, and domestic workers, including nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers. So if you have been impacted, we encourage you to apply to receive unemployment assistance from the Washington State Employment Security Department, which is the state department that oversees unemployment. And to apply, you can go to their website at esd.wa.gov/unemployment, or you can give them a call at 1-800-318-6022. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Andres.
Thank you, Janae. Emily Alvarado on housing.
Thank you, Andres, and good evening, Southeast Seattle. I'm Emily Alvarado. I'm the director of the Office of Housing, and really just want to acknowledge that we care about your housing stability in these challenging times. Really now more than ever, it is clear that housing is health, and yet many residents are struggling financially and unable to pay rent or their mortgage. And so we'd like you to know your rights and where you can find some resources. Next slide, please. So if you're a renter, you should know that on March 14th, Mayor Durkan signed into law an eviction moratorium. And on April 17th, Governor Inslee extended the statewide eviction moratorium and provided even more protections for tenants. This law is now in effect through June 4th. And during this time, you cannot be evicted for not paying rent. And your landlord cannot charge late fees or increase rents or deposit amounts. Now, during this time, if you can pay your rent, you should pay your rent. And that's because all rent payments delayed through the moratorium will still be due, but a landlord must offer a tenant a reasonable repayment plan. If you believe that your landlord is violating the moratorium, you can contact the Washington Attorney General's office to make a complaint. And that contact information is on the next slide. We get that June 4th is right around the corner and that renters are wondering what's next, and we'll continue our advocacy with the state and the feds to protect renters. You should know that Council has voted to provide residential tenants with a defense against evictions for 6 months after the coronavirus emergency moratorium in place now expires, and also voted to require landlords to offer payment plans to residential tenants. So for rent assistance, we're working really hard to try to get rent assistance in the hands of low-income households in need. Last month, United Way launched a rental assistance program called Home Base that provides rent assistance to households under 50% AMI. That's around $4,900 for a 4-person household per month, to folks who have been impacted by COVID. The city contributed to that fund. Also, private money was contributed, and the city committed $4 million in federal resources to make investments in rental assistance. A portion of that money will be given out through the United Way's Home Base program, and another larger portion will be made available through community-based organizations, including in the Southeast places like El Centro de la Raza and RIWA. If you are a homeowner and you're having trouble or may soon have trouble making your mortgage payment, then you might want to call your loan servicer, and that's the organization which you make your mortgage payment to. Depending on the type of loan you have, they are either required or strongly encouraged to work with you to help you out. If you have a federally backed mortgage, like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or the VA, your servicer has to give you options. But if you're like me and you're not sure whether your mortgage is federally backed, you might want to make a call first to get support before you call your loan servicer. And we recommend you call the Washington State Homeownership Resource Center. Their information is on this slide at 877-894-4663. They can help you think through your options. And it's really important. We want to make sure that homeowners do not lose their homes because of the crisis, particularly in neighborhoods like those in the Rainier Valley that have experienced significant displacement. The Office of Housing has, in partnership with HomeSite, a program that uses our housing levy funds to help income qualified homeowners get current on their housing payments and remain in their home. And you could get more information on that program by calling the Washington State Homeownership Resource Center. Again, we aim to be a resource for you, and you can find out more information or contact us at seattle.gov/housing/COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Next, Jason Johnson, who will talk about the city's plan on addressing homelessness.
Good evening. My name is Jason Johnson, and I have the privilege of serving as Director of the Human Services Department. Good to be with you. The Human Services Department is in place to ensure community safety, health, affordability by combating hunger, violence, poverty, and homelessness. And we do all of this work through an equity lens to ensure that we're addressing racial disproportionality in systems. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about some critical work that the city is doing in partnership with King County and Public Health to ensure that shelter, outreach, and hygiene services are in place as part of our response to the COVID epidemic. Next slide. First, shelter. The mayor mentioned some of this in her remarks, but it's been critically important that we have more beds, more spaces for people who are experiencing homelessness to go. We had to first acknowledge that there are several thousand people living without shelter and needed to create new capacity in our shelter system. Very quickly, during the COVID emergency, we were able to open nearly 100 new units of shelter at Lake Union in the Central District and up north in the Bitter Lake neighborhood. We also knew that we had hundreds of people living in very close quarters in congregate shelters, sometimes sleeping only inches apart from one another or sleeping head to toe. And we needed to offer a lot more space so that those congregate shelters could operate in alignment with public health's social distancing standards. And so we were able to open up a number of other city facilities, some at Seattle Center and some using community centers run by Parks and Recreation to offer that space to these shelter providers so that folks could sleep 6 feet apart at a minimum and have the space that they needed to engage with services during the day. We also worked in close partnership with King County and Public Health to make sure that the isolation and quarantine beds were in place for individuals who tested positive for COVID, but did not have a home to isolate or quarantine in. And also have been working across the county to open up these assessment and recovery beds. And we have several hundred of these beds at the ready, but currently have open and operating a recovery shelter in Shoreline, just north of Seattle. And these are for individuals who are still symptomatic and need a place to recover, but do not have a home to recover in. These assessment or recovery shelters were incredibly important, especially as we feared that there would be a need beyond its capacity inside of our hospital and healthcare centers. That was not the case, and so we have not seen as many people need to use these recovery shelters, but we have them at the ready should that need occur. Next slide. Another critical element of our homeless response is outreach. And at the city, we have an outreach team we call the navigation team. The navigation team during the COVID outbreak has really changed how it offers its services and have been engaging 7 days a week all over the city to make sure that folks have public health information. They've also been handing out a number of hygiene kits to make sure that people have drinkable water, a way to wash their hands, and also critically important is the list of resources that people can access around the city. The work to remove litter around large encampments continues, and it's been critically important that the navigation team be engaging with folks, doing simple health screenings and asking important questions about their health during this COVID crisis. The navigation team also suspended encampment removal operations with a few exceptions. We can't have living structures that completely block entire sidewalks, living structures prohibiting the safe entry and exit from buildings or the use of a facility. Also, there can be really critical public health and public safety issues to occupants of encampments or to the greater area that the NAV team continues to monitor. One example of this took place this week where there were 2 encampments in the Chinatown International District, Little Saigon neighborhood, and the navigation team had been engaged with the individuals living in these encampments for weeks, and over the past 10 days has been able to offer every individual living in those encampments the resource of a shelter bed. And yesterday and today made sure to go back into those encampments, make those offers of a shelter because the encampments needed to be removed. Those encampments in that area had a major blockage to sidewalks and roadways, as well as entryways to business, creating a really major accessibility issue. Likewise, there had been a number of public safety issues related to those 2 encampments. Next slide. Finally, I wanted to touch on hygiene. During the COVID epidemic, it's more important than ever for people to have access to hygiene services. And with so many businesses and city facilities closed, people who are experiencing homelessness, it's much more difficult for them to access a sink to wash their hands or a toilet to use. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Seattle Public Utilities and the partnership with Seattle Center, FAS, and Parks. We've been able to collectively open and operate many new hygiene services across the city. First, we accelerated the opening of winterized park restrooms. As you know, many of the park's restrooms are closed during the winter months and typically open when the weather improves and those parks begin to be more widely used. We opened many of the park's restrooms up early to make sure that people could access those sinks and toilets. We've opened several temporary hygiene stations with porta potties and hand washing stations all across the city, paying close attention to placing these hygiene services in areas that we know people congregate or where we knew that there was a closed hygiene service that people were used to using. We have opened up access to public libraries. As you know, libraries are closed to the public, but we've been able to open a handful of branches, including the Central Library downtown, so that people can still use the restrooms inside of those public facilities. And then finally, we've been able to, just this week, open staffed mobile shower and bathroom trailers. There is one that will be located in the near King Street Station, and another that will be mobile and will have a variety of different locations throughout the city. So these are, an important body of work led by our utility, and really excited that we've been able to get so many new hygiene services out in the community for people to use. With that, I think I'm handing it over to Jessica to talk about food.
Thank you, Jason. Next slide, please. Thank you all so much for being here and spending your evening with us. We know that right now food security is on top of people's minds. And so I want to share an overview of resources available for people who feel uncertain that they have enough food right now or possibly won't have enough in the near future. First, the image on the map here is a still shot from a map that's available on the mayor's COVID-19 resource page that you see here and that we've referenced a few times. This map is updated every weekday to make sure it has the most up-to-date information. So as meal programs shift to delivery services or food banks might have to change their hours, this map will provide you with the information you need to access a variety of food services in your neighborhood. I'll talk about some specific programs and you'll see websites and phone numbers to access these services. But again, I want to make sure that you know that all of this information can be found at the COVID-19 resource page. So don't feel like you need to quickly write down all of these numbers. Some of the specific programs to make sure you're aware of is first that Seattle Public Schools is distributing lunches from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. every Monday through Friday at 26 school sites throughout the city. And parents, guardians, or siblings can pick up the meals for students. Students do not need to be in attendance. SPS is also providing meal support for weekends where they're providing non-perishable food items like canned goods, snacks, etc. And those can be picked up at all of the 26 meal sites as well. And they're available for any family in need, even if you didn't participate in the backpack program before. Most Seattle food banks are still open with social distancing protocols in place. People can pick up bagged groceries at food banks and take them home, and some are also offering home delivery of food bank groceries. Almost all of the year-round senior meal programs are still operating and have changed to offer sack lunches or food boxes that are to go or in many cases are available for delivery. If you're a senior in need of meal delivery, you can contact the number I've listed here for help. And the map I referenced before has the details of all specific services for each food bank and meal program. In March, the mayor also launched a program to provide weekly grocery assistance for 8 weeks to families enrolled in many child care assistance or food assistance programs, as well as folks engaged with a number of community-based organizations. Through this program, we've been able to provide emergency grocery vouchers for 9,000 households, and we know that there's much, much more need in the community for this program. So we're still working with private sector and philanthropic partners to raise additional funds so that more people can benefit. Next slide, please. This week, we were excited to partner with United Way of King County, Food Lifeline, and Metro Access to launch a free home delivery of emergency food boxes across Seattle. These boxes have shelf-stable grocery items like canned fruit and vegetables, pasta, and other grains. And the boxes are designed to feed a family of 4 for 2 to 3 days and can be ordered multiple times if you're in need. To order a food box, you can contact United Way at the number listed here. Finally, I want to mention for folks who are part of the Basic Food Program that if you previously didn't receive the maximum benefit available to you, you should have seen your benefit increase to that maximum benefit amount available for your household due to the Families First Coronavirus Act passed by Congress. If you haven't previously been part of the Basic Food Program, it provides money for individuals and families to buy food from grocery stores, convenience stores, farmers markets, and other certified retailers. So you have the right to apply for this program anytime you need help, including in the case of sudden or temporary job loss. and you can visit washingtonconnection.org to apply. Finally, for existing basic food or SNAP customers, I want to make sure you know that you can now use your SNAP EBT card for online ordering of groceries, for pickup at Fred Meyer and QFC locations, or for grocery deliveries at Amazon with Amazon Fresh or Amazon Pantry. You just go to amazon.com/SNAP to register your EBT card. So those are some resources available. We want to make sure that folks who are in need of food have access to that food. So please do visit that webpage or let us know how we can assist you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd like to turn it over now to Mami Hara from Seattle Public Utilities.
Thank you, Andres. Hi, as Andres said, I'm Mami Hara, General Manager at Seattle Public Utilities, and I'd like to thank you for sharing this evening with us. Today, I have the privilege of speaking on behalf of both Seattle Public Utilities and Seattle City Light. I do think that Robert Smith, the manager of Seattle City Light, plans to be on the call and be available to take questions. Next slide, please. I'm going to describe some of the ways that both utilities are helping customers who have been negatively impacted by this crisis. I'd like to note that Seattle Public Utilities and Seattle City Light are completely aligned in these relief efforts as the sister utilities of the city. So first, I'll walk through the different types of relief that are available. And on the next slide, I'll walk through how customers can access these different kinds of financial relief from both our utilities. Starting at the top of this table, for both residential and commercial customers, we are suspending utility shutoffs through the COVID-19 state of emergency, which has been in effect since early March and will continue to be in effect until the mayor proclaims it over. We don't know when that will be at this point. We're also reconnecting any customer who previously had their service disconnected. Second, we're allowing more flexible payment plans for customers to indicate that they've been having trouble paying their bill. This includes being more flexible about the amount of down payment that a customer can pay when setting up their payment plan, as well as the length of the prepayment period that they can choose. So far, the utilities have set up well over 4,000 flexible payment plans in response to COVID. Third, we're allowing eligible residential customers to do what we're calling a fast track enrollment into the utility discount program, what we also call the UDP. The UDP provides 50% off of every SPU bill that a customer receives and 60% off their City Light bill. And normally a household must submit proof of income documentation for each member of their household as part of their application to roll in the UDP. Now, in response to the COVID crisis, the city is allowing households who meet the income requirements to simply fill out a short online form in which they just state their income and household size and attest to the truthfulness of that by signing the form and submit it online for the fast track enrollment. So far, over 8,000 households have used the UDP fast track application. This effort is an expansion of a pre-existing pilot that was in place before the outbreak of COVID, so we're excited to expand it. Fourth, City Light is doing proactive outreach on behalf of both utilities to small business customers who are delinquent in their payments to proactively offer and set up flexible payment plans. And finally, we're waiving late fees and interest charges on overdue balances for residential customers, small businesses, and nonprofits. Next slide, please. So how can customers access these various kinds of COVID-19 utility relief? You can contact our utility contact center via phone at 206-684-3000 between the hours of 7:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. to set up a flexible payment plan and to learn more about our bill assistance programs. You can also submit an email online any time of day at the links provided on the slide here. You can also submit questions and concerns through links provided on each of our websites. Soon, you'll be able to reach us through a joint customer self-service portal. And we look forward to informing you of the launch of that site soon. And to access the fast track enrollment for the utility discount program, you can either go to the city's main utility discount program website, which is seattle.gov/UDP, where you can learn more about the program and eligibility requirements, or go directly to the fast track application form. You can click on the link or copy the link at the provided at the bottom of the slide here. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. Even before this COVID era, our utilities were working hard to make sure that our services were accessible to all and that our suite of assistance programs address the needs of folks during times of crisis and need. But more of us are in need than ever. So from the onset of the pandemic, we expanded the range of our efforts. So the efforts I described in previous slides are above our pre-existing utility discount program enrollment approach and emergency assistance programs and conservation programs, which are all still available as well. So please engage with and spread the word on all of our various programs that help with bill reduction. And please remember that in addition to the discount program, both utilities have emergency assistance, conservation assistance, and detection of waste that may impact your bills. So again, please see our websites. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the men and women at both utilities who have shown up for work throughout the pandemic to make sure that the water keeps flowing, your lights stay on, and your waste managed. Their safety is paramount in all we do. This would be a very different time without them. And also many thanks to you for all you are doing to keep our community informed and connected. And with that, I'll hand it off to Randy Engstrom.
Good evening, South Seattle neighbors, and thank you for joining all of us tonight. The Office of Arts and Culture was founded in 1971 during the worst recession in the city's history. That year, Boeing laid off 65,000 employees, 65% of its workforce, and a billboard went up next to Boeing Field that said, "Will the last person out of Seattle please turn out the lights?" When Mayor Wes Ullman was asked why you would form a local arts agency in the context of Seattle's worst recession in its history, he said, "Because we have to give people hope." And I believe that that is still the business that our office is in, and that is still the work that artists and creative workers and cultural institutions in our city continue to provide, even in these dark times and through this crisis. The creative community of the city continues to stand up for our city. Next slide, please. We were the first arts agency in the country and the first city in the country to set up a relief fund for our cultural community. We didn't ask people to apply. We simply said, the 238 arts organizations that we support, we are going to extend your contract and give you immediate relief. We're going to amend your contract and compensate you for anything you can do to pivot and respond to this crisis. We were able to work with our partners at Seattle Center and the Parks Department to provide rent relief. And the very first response that we saw in the creative community when this crisis hit was the artist and author Ijeoma Oluo standing up her Artist COVID Relief Fund. We put $50,000 towards that fund to help individual artists and another $50,000 towards our partners at Artist Trusts so that we could also help our individual artists and workers. And yet we know that 2/3 of artists in this country are currently unemployed. 54% of the sector has lost its job, and $135 million of local revenue has been lost. So while we did a lot early and we're proud of that work, we know there is much more work to be done. Next slide, please. One way that we know that artists have continued to show up for their community is to help keep us together. And we created this partnership with our friends at the Department of Neighborhoods, and now over a dozen departments citywide called Seattle Together. What started as a hashtag related to the Make a Joyful Noise campaign, where we were invited to celebrate our frontline workers and first responders, became a multi-departmental effort that asked the question, how can we stay connected and how can we lift each other up while we are forced to be physically distant? We answered that question first as a city, and now with our community. We launched a campaign called Public Art Comes to Your Front Yard, which you may have seen in your neighborhood. The sign on the slide here was by South Park artist Amaranta Santis. We hired 10 emerging artists of color to produce pro-social, public health, and community responsive images, printed those on yard signs, and distributed more than 2,000 throughout the city. We took our Creative Advantage program, our partnership with Seattle Public Schools, and hired 30 teaching artists to each create 10-minute lesson plans, 3 of them each, so that our families could stream this content at home. And so parents like me, who are learning how to homeschool, had creative arts instruction to share with their families and with their kids. We got to partner with the Office of Civil Rights on the anti-bias and anti-hate campaign that you heard Mariko reference earlier, and we used some of the artwork and some of the images by these emerging artists of color in order to illustrate the billboards and bus campaigns that were going to spread these messages around how hate and bias and racism will not be tolerated in our city. And then, due to a great partnership with Seattle Public Utilities and with Seattle City Light, we are going to launch a program called Essentially Seattle, inviting 25 local artists of many disciplines to document the work of our frontline and first responder workers. We're going to document the work of our utility partners, our public health partners, our public safety partners, and the work of community. Because as much as the city has responded and we're proud of how we have, what this is really about is lifting up community and building social bonds as we go through this crisis together. Today, we're really proud to have launched seattle.gov. It's a website that we stood up to both tell the stories of how we're all experiencing this time together, to share content and media, because we're not going to be going to see festivals and concerts for some time, as the mayor said, and to find out ways to help, to volunteer, to donate, and to plug in. We know that as we face reopening, recovery, and civic reimagination, we want to center a community that can be built back better. As the mayor said, we want to center community voice and co-create those solutions with you. We want to make a city that's more equitable and more just, and we want to call the question of what the city is that we want to be. Who do we want to be as a city, and what's the city want to create? It's in that spirit that Seattle Together, seattle.gov, hashtag Seattle Together Stories was created and conceived, and we hope that you help us tell that story and shape that narrative and chart a different course for the future of our city. Thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight, and thanks for believing in your city.
Thank you very much, Randy. Seattle Together has been a great partnership with arts and so many of my colleagues here on this call, and I really encourage listeners to go visit seattletogether.org. So we're going to go into question and answers. Please, as a reminder, continue to put your questions in the chat box, and we will try to address them here. I want to bring forward first Bobby Lee. There's a question specifically around grants available to Muslim businesses who may be not able to incur interest. And what was the city's response and plan to addressing services and resources to the Muslim community?
Right. Thank you very much. Ooh. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. In the state of Washington, the Constitution restricts local governments from providing grants and loans to small businesses. It's called the gift of public funds. So the only funding source that we were able to use for small business grants is federal dollars, and it's called Community Development Block Grants. And because it is federal dollars, it comes with its own rules. And there's also a limited number of businesses that we were able to support through that funding source. And that the rules that follows with that money is that we can only provide funding for what they call micro businesses, which is 5 employees or less. And then there are certain socioeconomic indicators that we have to follow in allocating those funds. In the first round of allocation of the federal funds, we did hit close to 80% small businesses owned by people of color. And we're proud of that fact because of what we talked about earlier, the disproportionate impact to small businesses owned by people of color. We are hoping to also continue to fundraise with private dollars in order to allocate additional capital to support our small businesses. And we're hoping to make an announcement at some point here soon. So keep your ears to the ground and hope that we can launch this in the near future. If there are businesses who are listening on this phone and you would like to donate to our campaign, it's called All in Seattle campaign. Please visit our website called All in Seattle. And if you would like to make a donation in order to support our small businesses, that's one way to really support our community. And so I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Bobby. The next question for Janae. Previous to the pandemic, the city was doing some work around benefits and worker rights for gig workers. Can you give an update on that work and especially within the context of the pandemic? What are the next steps around that?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, you're right. So back in November of last year, City Council unanimously passed a package of new laws, which is known as the Mayor's Fair Share Plan, which concerned drivers of transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. There were two protections. One was setting up protections around deactivation from platforms, so ensuring that folks have access to the tool that they need in order to receive work. And then the other was tasked us with looking at a minimum compensation standard for drivers. So the current COVID, of course, as many of my colleagues have experienced, has had an impact on our work. That being said, we are still working very hard on ensuring those things come to fruition. So I don't have the specific, off the top of my head, the specific timeline for those laws, but we are working hard on them and making sure that we can bring the mayor's vision to fruition soon. So you should see some action from us in the coming months because we do know that, especially now when our gig workers are folks that are making sure that we can get to our doctor's appointments and are out there in the community, still working, making sure that we can stay home safely, make sure that they are also supported during this time. So thank you for letting me share that information with you, and stay tuned from OLS on that.
Thank you, Janae. The next question, I think maybe either for Jason or Assistant Chief Diaz. In the current pandemic, more service providers, and there's a couple of questions that relate to this, but for example, like Boys and Girls Club or Southwest Youth and Family Services are providing youth services during this pandemic, especially for a large population of youth impacted by violence. What are the plans of the city for the community safety RFP moving forward as it relates to this population of youth?
Great. I'll start and then offer up some time for SPD. So this is Jason Johnson with the Human Services Department, and HSD invests $4.4 million annually in community safety and $3.8 million annually in youth development. And the community safety RFP released last year for 2020 contracts. And those contracts are in place. Those fund sources are not impacted by COVID. And we are, as a department, offering the maximum amount of flexibility in how those local dollars can be used by organizations. This year, in 2020, for 2021 contracts, we were scheduled to release an RFP related to youth development. Because of the pandemic and because of our limited ability to engage with community in a way that would structure that RFP, we have delayed that RFP by 1 year. So the community can expect for those youth development funds to be put out to bid through an RFP in the spring of 2021. So for now, the $3.8 million in contracts that we currently have in place for youth development are active, and those funds, again, are not impacted by the COVID response, and we are offering the maximum level of flexibility in how those funds can be used. And so if there are any questions related to either of those investment areas in community safety or youth development, I encourage you to contact our Youth and Family Empowerment Division Director, Tanya Kim, or myself. And both of our contact information is on the city website through the directory. But to give my direct email, jason.johnson@seattle.gov, happy to answer any of your specific questions.
And thank you, Jason. I think I just want to echo, this is a huge support for the community. This is Adrian Diaz, the Assistant Chief. an ounce or $1 in prevention, really saves a whole lot more on the on the enforcement side. So we're really, such supportive in many of these programs that the HSD is, funding and supporting. So we are glad that many of that is moving forward. I know that also fits in alignment with how we address youth violence in general, as I mentioned before, the public health model, and really trying to address some of those risk factors. So we're excited that HSD is still continuing to move forward on investments in our youth, and so we're just supporting that. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Chief. Next question for Sam Zimbabwe. We have a few questions around the Safe Streets program, specifically why those streets, and kind of what is the process moving forward for maybe folks that want to include other streets, or folks that have questions about their street in general.
Sure, that's a great question, and it's great to be with everybody tonight. So, I think the mayor talked about very well the sort of the rationale behind identifying some streets that could be limited to through traffic and enable people more space for both recreation and essential transportation. And what we did is we looked at our existing network of neighborhood greenways. So these were already streets that had some traffic calming, some crossing improvements at our arterial streets, at the bigger streets, and some directional signage that help people navigate to and from various destinations. And they're streets that connect community destinations, neighborhood retail, parks, schools, and things like that. And so we thought about how we could, and those streets were all streets that had some level of community engagement process around identifying and providing those investments before. And so in this time when it's hard to have a lot of community engagement, we worked on the Stay Healthy Streets as a way to limit through traffic further, but still provide all local access. So if you have a house or a destination on those blocks, you still have all the access you need, but limit through traffic. And we've seen good success. We've seen biking increase on those streets, even though traffic overall in the city is down, and vehicle traffic decrease more than the citywide decrease that we've seen. And so as we look towards recovery and as we look towards what our transportation system is going to need to do going forward, we think that those are great opportunities to maintain some of these connections that have been started, and then also work with community on how to engage in continued upgrades. I think some of what Randy Engstrom talked about with Seattle Together, that sort of continuing that same theme of bringing communities together around community assets. These Stay Healthy Streets are ripe opportunities for that. In terms of where we go from here and potential expansion of that, it was really important for us to have the neighborhood greenways as a network that could be built on, could be expanded. We'll look to do additional streets and opportunities, both for a Stay Healthy Street approach or other changes, but we also need to find ways to continue to engage with people and communities through this time when that is also challenging. So, and then we're also dealing with some of the same budget constraints that have been talked about as well already this evening. So, no specific answers right now on exactly where we might go from here, but we look forward to continuing to build out a city where people can be safe walking and biking, or however they choose to get around.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to go to Sam Acefa and Emily Alvarado for the next question around how can the city, there's a lot of questions around worries about what's known as kind of disaster gentrification or gentrification in general of the South End. How can the city be proactive in preventing that from happening? Sam, why don't we start with you?
That is a #1 issue and concern that we have now. If you recall, even before COVID, that was one of the biggest challenges that we've been facing in Seattle because of the unprecedented growth and changes that are taking place throughout the city, specifically in Southeast Seattle. We are working on a number of fronts. As you know, some of the Equitable Development Initiative, one of the central tenets of that program has been to create community wealth and community ownership in a number of areas that are impacted by gentrification before COVID. We need to work on doubling up on those, especially now through disaster gentrification, which means people are going to take advantage of this disaster and probably move residents and businesses out of the Southeast Seattle Central District. So within the Equitable Development Initiative program in my office, we have over, I think, around 11 organizations that we're working with, about $825,000 grants through our Equitable Development funding. That currently my team and my staff has been working with a number of the organizations around understanding what the current impact of COVID is and what we need to think about as we move forward in the policies that we need to address to mitigate that. So as the mayor talked about how we need to center, equity and people who are impacted by this, not only the health, but the economic challenges because of COVID, we want to work to figure out how we double up on community ownership, whether it's small businesses, working with Office of Housing around affordable housing and affordable housing programs, continuing to work on the Equitable Development Initiative, which is grounded on community ownership and organizations that are coming to us with ideas that they believe are anti-displacement actions and how we work through that. And we will be continuing to have that conversation with you and figure out how we mitigate those issues immediately as much as is possible, and how we work with the existing resources that we have to address those issues.
Thank you, Sam. Emily, do you want to add anything there?
I'll add a few things. First of all, thanks for the question. We understand, displacement has been occurring at an alarming rate in Southeast Seattle. We have made significant investments in the last few years to try to create more affordable housing, serving a range of folks' needs in Southeast in particular, including investments in Ethiopian community in Seattle to build a senior housing building, some investments in Rainier Beach to help include a food bank. We're not going to stop on those investments. We will continue to make more affordable housing available. And we understand that in these moments, we have to keep our eye on some of the long-range infrastructure investments that we'll continue to make. Also, we have to make sure that we don't lose any ground right now. So we're going to really look out for stabilizing existing homeowners, stabilizing renters so that we don't see an immediate wave of new displacement from individuals who are already living in the area. Third, we're going to continue to get creative. We have a partnership with Sound Transit currently underway where we're looking to turn some of those small sites along MLK that have been fenced off for years into permanently affordable homeownership for the community. We want to do that in partnership with community. So you can count on the Office of Housing and the City of Seattle to continue to be a partner in long-range investments to address displacement. And if you identify immediate needs and ways that we can be helpful, absolutely feel free to reach out to me, emily.alvarado@seattle.gov. We need your solutions as well, because those community-driven solutions are really going to be important at this time.
Thank you, Emily. The next question for Jessica Finkoven and Mami Hara. The mayor mentioned a little bit about the challenge of climate change. What can the city continue to do to advance a plan to reduce carbon emissions and address climate change?
Thanks for the question. This is Jessica with the Office of Sustainability and Environment. First, really appreciate this question and the reminder that we need to continue making progress against the crisis of climate change as we address this crisis of COVID-19. The city continues many of its plans and protections uh, to address climate change, including many of our plans around energy efficiency in buildings, around the clean, affordable electricity that Seattle City Light provides. Those are still mostly in place. What excites me right now is that the mayor has been asked to join the COVID-19 Recovery Task Force for the C40 Climate Mayors Group. That group is a group of mayors from the largest cities around the world, and the task force is 10 mayors around the world who have been asked to come together and figure out the best practices that we all can replicate to recover from this crisis in a way that reduces pollution, that puts people to work, and that rebuilds a more equitable society. So I'm thrilled that the mayor is going to be a leader in that group, and I think it's going to allow us to come up with new ideas, better ideas than the things we've been trying to date, to ensure that we're learning from other cities around the globe and that we're sharing our successes and our lessons learned here in Seattle.
Mommy, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Jessica. That's a perfect framing of the need and the opportunity in Seattle. One thing that Seattle, or several things that Seattle is going for it, is that it has a long history of experimentation in climate resiliency through the development of green infrastructure, through reduction of carbon emissions in its fleets, such as Seattle Public Utilities, a green fleet for hauling waste, and many other experiments that have happened. We also have a strong interest in forms of distributed infrastructure that create opportunity for low barrier work opportunities, as well as greater climate resilience and the development of carbon sinks here in Seattle. And so we really eagerly look forward to working with communities around Seattle and among the departments to experiment, further experiment and deploy at scale significant investment in climate protecting measures.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Mommy. The next question is for Randy and for Bobby. We have a lot of questions around kind of the future of work in terms of workforce development and specifically related to youth in the creative economy. What is the city doing to organize around a future that includes that type of economy? So maybe start with Bobby and then go to Randy.
Thank you for the question. Clearly, the economy has shifted, realigned itself during this pandemic. And in part is because the consumer behavior has changed. So that's really was the starting point. When consumers change their behavior, then the economy will realign itself. And so there are some short-term realignment that is going on where certain sectors are shrinking, and then there are other sectors that appears to be growing. But in this short-term analysis, we also have to keep in mind that there's a broader macroeconomics where the overall economy, global economy, is also evolving outside of the pandemic. And so one of the things that we have to do as a city is we have to ensure that the local youth and adults, and especially those that have been displaced due to the pandemic, have opportunities to skill up or try different occupation where there is towards the growth sector during this economic change. So our goal is to relook at our investments in workforce development towards youth and adults and see how we can help folks to, especially those that's been displaced, to realign themselves to the changing economy. And And creative industry in particular is really a foundational component that could really help drive middle class jobs in the future as the economy is evolving. So I'll leave it there and then turn it over to Randy.
Thank you, Bobby, and Echo, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think it's clear that this crisis has accelerated trends in the workforce that were already happening, both around sort of the network economy and the digital economy. I think it's also never been more evident the value of content creation and storytelling as we're all sheltered in place. Companies like Netflix and Hulu are doing quite well, and all of the people who create content for them are doing well to the degree that they're allowed to shoot and produce at the moment. Long term, that is an economy we need to prepare our young people for, and we knew that before the crisis. That's why Office of Economic Development, Office of Film and Music, and the Office of Arts and Culture worked to create a roadmap for an inclusive creative economy throughout much of 2019. So we know that's going to be necessary. And while I cited the facts earlier that the crisis had a disproportionate early impact on a creative community, it's also worth noting that that same community is able to be redeployed right now while we're staying home and staying distant in creating content online and in murals and in other forums for us to be able to sort of ease our anxiety and our mental strain. And long term, we're going to need that creative capital in order to rebuild and reconstruct and reimagine the economy that's going to be on the other side of this crisis. In a strange way, we didn't have the time to prepare, but we're being sort of catapulted into that future economy much more quickly than we had expected. And I think if we seize this as an opportunity, much like the safe streets, there are things that maybe we could have done and we're doing now as a result of the crisis, and that presents us with a particular kind of opportunity. So how do we leverage that? How do we build infrastructure around that? And how do we ensure, unlike the economy that we've had with the massive growth in tech, how do we make sure the young people growing up in our community here are prepared to benefit from, take advantage of, and participate in the creative economy that is coming and that is growing?
Thank you, Randy and Bobby. I want to turn to Mariko. There's a question specifically around how we continue to engage in criminal justice system conversations, and particularly the status of the budget for justice conversation. Can you address that?
Sure. Thanks, Andres, and thanks for that question. You know, I think you've heard a theme throughout all of these questions and answers and presentations that a lot of the critical issues that we're addressing right now have been exacerbated by the pandemic, but that they existed previous to the pandemic. And this is especially true of those that are impacted by systemic racism, criminal justice system being, you know, just really high on the list. And so a couple of things to talk about there. One is that work obviously continues to be important, and our office has a body of work that is dedicated to criminal legal system alternatives and policy changes. And you know, during the pandemic, one of the things that we were, you know, very early on concerned about was what's happening for people who are incarcerated. And so that was one sort of immediate area where we needed to pivot and really advocate for, you know, reducing the population of folks that were incarcerated. For us in the city of Seattle, you know, that would be our population in King County jail. And so we, you know, like they have done, they've been doing a lot of work on reducing that jail population. Originally, when we started on this, folks were doubled up in bunks, no access to hand sanitizer, very little access to hand washing. The several hundred folks have been released from jail, so the crowding and the double bunking is much improved. And there's more access to hand washing. I mean, it still is an ongoing problem, and so we're still, you know, continuing to work with folks to monitor that. You know, and that's specifically related to the, you know, COVID pandemic. The ongoing work that we do and that the question references, there was some really strong advocacy on the part of community groups who are, working on criminal justice reform, organized under the umbrella of Budget for Justice. And so there was, it was a very successful effort, and City Council made a huge investment in directing funds, about $1 million to organizations working on alternatives to the criminal legal system, and to reducing harm done by the criminal legal system. So that work is continuing. We were able to get support from both City Council and Mayor's Office to engage in a community-driven process. So not a typical RFP process, but we have a collaborative grant-making process that has a group of folks that include those who have lived experience of incarceration and lived experience with their criminal legal system, who are part of the decision-making group. And as a matter of fact, they're meeting right now as we are meeting to finalize the RFP, which will be, when they finalize it, probably pretty shortly, will be issued to the public, and then those grants will start to, that grant making process will proceed. So it's moving forward with, just delay not related to COVID, but more related to just the additional time we need to take to ensure that people who are not typically engaged in those processes have the ability to, build their capacity and participate meaningfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariko. Thank you to all my colleagues who presented material here tonight, and thank you to all of you, community and neighbors, for participating today. As a reminder, this webinar will be on the Seattle channel in the next few days, and posted on the mayor's social media as well if you need to access it. Please also, you can access all the information that we talked about today at seattle.gov /mayor/COVID-19. The Department of Neighborhoods is also weekly bringing these types of conversations to you from 2:30 to 4. You can find more information on seattle.gov /neighborhoods. We have the next webinar tomorrow. We're going to be talking about mental health impacts and services and resources for community. Continue the conversation around public safety, talk a little bit more about Seattle Together, and then continue the conversation both around small business support and rent and mortgage assistance. Thank you very much for your time. Stay healthy, stay safe. This webinar is over.